first memories of the war actually were of the house being bombed. We were all in a shelter that collapsed on top of us. And my memories were of being dug out rather than of it collapsing on top of us. And as we were dug out, I was sat on the side of the trench, and my little brother was put beside me, and I was told to hold him while they dug everybody else out. And there must have been quite a lot of people in, because I remember several people there doing the digging and lifting people out. Nobody was injured, but my father had been knocked out because one of the wooden posts that supported it fell on top of his back, and but he was okay afterwards. So that is my first memory watching the house burning down and holding on to my little brother. After that was a lorry coming with 2 Australian soldiers who piled us all onto the lorry. We were standing packed together like sardines. My mother had my little brother, so she was in the front of the lorry in the cab with the driver, and the rest of us stood at the back. It was very, very hot, and I heard 2 gunshots, and I was told that the 2 dogs had been killed because Japanese ate dogs. I found out that was true afterwards, but nevertheless I was upset about that, seeing the 2 bodies lying there. And I think the trip, the journey, I don't remember anything of that at all. I remember getting to the airport, and there were a lot of aeroplanes on the ground, and some had already left. And people were rushing to get on the planes, and suddenly the Japanese came over and started strafing with machine guns. And planes on the ground were exploding, and planes in the air were exploding. And my mother and father ran with my brother and myself to the perimeter of the airfield, and we crouched down there. And we were very lucky, because so many were injured. There were people screaming, crying, running, and we were very lucky. We escaped, all of us. My father opened this enormous golf umbrella and was multicoloured. And thinking about it in retrospect, it must have been saying, "Here we are, get us," but nobody bothered. They left us under our multicoloured umbrella. My grandparents were there at the time, and an uncle who were visiting. It was a bad time to visit, I suppose, but they couldn't get back to Britain because the war was going here, so they couldn't get back again. So they decided to go overland to try and get to India through the jungle, and they were killed, and my uncle was killed. Everybody who was with them in that group were killed, but we didn't know that till the end of the war. We didn't know till the Red Cross told us. Because of my brother and I, my parents didn't feel it was safe to take us through the jungle with all the dangers that were there. There were snakes, insects. There was the weather. It was very, very wet at the time. There were what they called dacoits. Those were the Burmese who were going out in groups and killing people for all that they were carrying with them. And of course there were the Japanese snipers who were trying to prevent people escaping. And my parents didn't think it was safe to go with children, so they decided to sit it out, whatever happened. We were all herded together then and marched a long way. I don't remember how long. I just remember it was day upon day. We were just walked from one place to another. We eventually went to a place where I think it must have been a Quaker school previously, because they called it the Brothers' School. And my mother and my brother and I were left there with all the other women and children, and the men were taken to the British police. I think there was some sort of a police academy there, because I seem to remember they said it was the training place for the British soldiers. So I think that was where my father went with the other men. He was allowed to come back when my little brother took ill, and he was there with my mother when my brother died. and he died of malnutrition, dysentery, which was quite soon after the war. I should think it would have been within 6 or 8 months, because we were walked from place to place and left there for weeks at a time. I would have been, I would think, 3 when the war started, around about 3, just under 3. And I was 6 at the end. I had my 6th birthday just after the war, which was a very memorable birthday. My father and mother were sitting together with him, and I was feeling a little bit left out. And there was a centipede on the wall. Centipedes there, big and poisonous. And I was telling them there was a centipede on the wall, and I was getting quite hurt that they weren't interested that there was a centipede near me whilst they were nursing my brother. And not long after that, my mother got very upset, so I assumed that was when he had died. And I remember then somebody fetching in a green box. I don't know why I should remember it was a green box, but I remember it was a green box, and they put my brother in it. And as I remember it, they planted him under a tree. That was my memory of his death. I only remember him very vaguely. I remember holding hands with him and with our ama and walking by the lake with the dogs. That's all I remember of him, really. But he was 13 months old when he died. We were taken again and marched a long, long way. We went to a place called Meiktila, which was a hill station, and which was where all the Europeans used to go during the hot season. They all had big houses there. The houses were lived in by Japanese officers, and we were taken to what had been the British Army barracks. I'm not sure if it was Alexander or Alexandra barracks. It was one or the other. And we were kept in there for some time, I would think about a year. And after that, when things started getting rough for the Japanese, they put us out of there, and by then the houses had all been bombed and were pretty much ruins, and we had to live in the ruins, in amongst the ruins. And the Japanese army took over the barracks. When we were in the barracks, it must have been very tough for my mother, because she and all the healthy women were made to march a long way. I don't know how far, but it was a long way. I went with them once. They were marched to a river where they had to stand knee-deep in the water and wash all the Japanese uniforms and bandages and dressings and things. And I actually have a note somewhere that my mother wrote about how awful it was. She never, ever spoke about the war. As far as she was concerned, it hadn't happened, and I was not allowed to talk about it. But she wrote little notes here and there that I've found since. And she has a note somewhere about how awful that was that time. It was while we were there that she was raped, and I saw her raped. A Japanese officer marched up, and he just said, "You," and raped her there. And when I started to scream, one of the other women got hold of me and put her hand on my mouth and said, "Don't make a noise or he'll hit you." And when he had raped her, he started to kick her because she didn't bow low enough when she said, "Thank you, master." He kicked her senseless and then marched off. And I'll never forget what they sounded like, their boots. They must have had metal tips on their heels or something, because of the way they marched. And they made an awful noise with their boots. But that, I suppose, was something a child shouldn't see. My father was taken along with the other men, and they had to do the roads. They had to mend the roads and keep the roads passable. You know, where the bombs had been dropped and there were holes in the road, they had to amend them so that the Japanese could get their vehicles over the roads, make them passable for them. And that was what he did through most of the war, until near the end, when he was allowed to come and join my mother and us, because he had a tattoo on his arm And on one arm he had the Union Jack and something in Latin, I don't know what it was, and on the other he had my mother's name. And they were convinced that he was a spy. They were convinced he was a spy and they wanted to catch him. And he was allowed to come back and stay with us, and they would suddenly appear every now and again. Somebody would be there to see where we were, what we were doing, whether we were still there. And of course, I mean, he wasn't a spy, but he did have notes, which was fortunate that they were never seen. But they were innocent notes. There were notes that he'd made of all the people. He had been a lay preacher before the war. And the priest, the local priest, was a Burmese man. I have his name somewhere. And he asked if my father could help him because it was so tough at the time. There were so many people dying. He actually asked if he could be interned with us. He need not have been, but he asked if he could be interned with us because he wanted to stay with his flock, if you like. And my father helped him, so during that time he made notes of all the people who died and lists of them, how they had died and the date they died. So that, I suppose, could be quite useful for somebody. Oh, he would have been shot or had his head chopped off. There's no doubt about that. He probably have had his head chopped off. They were very fond of that. It was one of their favourite pastimes, I think. Yeah, in amongst his notes in several places, he wrote, "Our captors are very kind." And when I asked him about that, he said that was an insurance. It was a way of keeping my head on my shoulders if ever my notes had been found. So I suppose it was fair enough. It was, I suppose it's understandable. Even I can understand that, bitter as I am at times. They were cruel in every way. For a start, there was no food. We had no food. We foraged like animals to survive. Of course, in between, there were kind Japanese soldiers. There were occasionally kind ones. But in general, the diet was pretty diabolical. I can remember when we lived in those houses that we were actually foraging in what had been the vegetable gardens and finding herbs and various things that we could add to our diet. But we had a Japanese soldier, we called him the Whistler, and he cooked for the officers up in the big house up on the hill. And after dismembering the cow, he would have to get rid of the bones in a pit, a lime pit. And rather than dispose of the bones, he sometimes would chuck bits over the fence. He always whistled first so that we'd know he was coming. And we never ever found out his name. We just called him the Whistler. But he did a lot for us. Boil them with whatever we could find, make it last out as long as we could, boil them over and over again with rice, which was the staple. They used to give us a container of rice each a day. Disgusting rice full of weevils and all kinds of things, but nevertheless it was rice and it was food. One day he didn't come again, and we're just assuming and hoping that he wasn't seen and perhaps shot. If they had found out, he would have been shot. But maybe, hopefully, he just moved on, as they did quite a lot. We had an officer called Kato who came to our house, to this house that we were in. He was one who had been sent to check up on my father. And when he found there was a child there, he was very touched because he had two sisters about the same age as I was. And he missed his family and he missed his sisters. And when he came again, he smuggled food under his tunic and brought us all. And he brought me little gifts of fan with a picture of cherry trees and blossom. He brought me some playing cards, things that he had got for his sisters that he intended to take back for his sisters. And he gave me a sash which had been presented to him. He said he wasn't going to make it back to Japan. He knew he was going to die, and he wanted someone to have it. And this sash was one that had been given to most of the Japanese soldiers. It was embroidered with red spots, and each spot denoted a blessing from a relative or a friend. And he gave me this and asked me to look after it for him. So I kept it. And in fact, I gave it to Kathy. I gave it to the museum, amongst other bits and pieces. And when I went to Japan in 2005, they gave me pictures of it to give to his family. They were very touched because they didn't know anything about any of this. He had never spoken about the war to them at all. He had never mentioned it. They didn't even know he had been in the war, his daughters and son, because it was not something he ever spoke about. I think probably at the airport where the bombing, and it was just, it all happened so suddenly. Seeing the house burn, I don't remember being frightened, just pretty amazed, just seeing the house going up. But I was frightened at the airport. I think that was probably when I was most frightened. I think after that, children are quite adaptable to anything, and I think you gradually adapt even to something as horrific as the war. I remember playing with the other kids, and we used to draw pictures in the mud with sticks, and we devised games with stones, with pebbles, and the soil was very clayey, and we used to make little pots and pans and little cups with clay, which we dried in the sun, and so children adapt. However awful, I think children do always adapt somehow. There was an old lady who used to be a school teacher, and she used to get us all together to teach us when the mothers were taken to the river to do all the washing and stuff there. She used to teach us, and she used to have us all sitting on the floor there, and she used to teach us. The first Christmas, I remember that. Obviously, there were no toys. There were going to be no toys, but we didn't believe that. There was a boy called Derek who was very clever. He was a little older than the rest of us, and he knew everything. And he said, of course, Father Christmas would come. It was obvious. He went everywhere. He never missed anybody. And he would be there, definitely. He said what would happen was that the British planes would come over, and they would get the Japanese. They would divert them. And while the Japanese were diverted, Father Christmas would slip in and leave the presents. And that was just what would happen. And it did. We all got presents. We got little notebooks that had been made with little stubby pencils that had been obviously cut, so that they could spread them out. And we had rag dolls. And everybody had presents. Father Christmas came. They had at one time been quite grand, those houses. They were the country houses of the richer people who went there in the summer when it was too hot elsewhere. They had all been bombed, but there was shelter of a sort. And we all sort of moved into these houses, probably 3 or 4 families to each house, and made ourselves as comfortable as we could under the circumstances. My brother's been back there on holiday. He was born after the war. And he said the houses just didn't exist at all now. There was nothing there at all. Just open land. Time is difficult because I remember it all in snapshots, and time is difficult for me to say. I don't know, probably about a year, I would think. But during that time when my father was allowed back, right at the end of the war, he heard that since the Japanese soldiers were moving on, there was no one to cook for the officers. And he saw this as a wonderful way of providing food for us, so he offered to cook. Now, my father, I don't think he'd ever been in a kitchen. He certainly didn't know how to cook anything. And he went up there, and my mother went with him. And he became what they called koko for some reason. And my mother was the one who actually did the cooking. My father was supposed to have been the cook. And they smuggled us in because they weren't supposed. They smuggled me in because they weren't supposed to. And I was put in a cupboard while they were there. And every now and again I got a spoon of sugar or something like that, you know, that wouldn't be missed because they watched him like a hawk to make sure he didn't steal any food. But something very odd happened because I remember there was a lot of shouting one day and my father slammed the door and he pushed my mother in a cupboard and he got in one. And apparently one of the Japanese soldiers had just gone berserk and he was shooting everybody outside. And he had a sword as well and he was chasing everybody, including his own fellow soldiers, until somebody shot him. And that was another scary time, sitting there, you know, just hearing all these voices and the shooting and the banging, and while this man rushed around. But then after that, things got quite a lot worse because the Japanese were moving on and we were in kind of limbo. There was no rice, no rations, because they'd all gone, just the odd ones as they were passing through. But in my father's notes, he writes that my mother went down when she heard that they were shelling. We were on a hill and the British were shelling upwards and the Japanese were shelling downwards as they were escaping. And my mother actually crawled on her belly through the shrubbery and underneath all the shelling down to where the British were. And I'm telling you now, they weren't Japanese, they weren't Americans. They were British soldiers, because people keep insisting that the Americans got there first. No, they didn't. It was the British soldiers and it was the Gurkhas who were there. And it was a major hall. And he said, "Good God, woman, where have you come from?" And my mother said, "I've come from the top of the hill." And he said, "Why have you risked your life doing that?" And she said, "My family are starving, I want some food." And he gave her a tin of condensed milk, some tea, which my father thought was wonderful. He hadn't had a cup of tea for all those years. Typically Brit, you know, the tea comes first. And some potatoes and some rice. And my mother crawled up again with her booty. And the next day it was a lot quieter. And somebody carried me down. I was quite ill by then, and somebody carried me down, and the Red Cross were there, and they gave us clothes and food. So that was the end of the war. It affected my father. Was never the same. My father died a bitter, broken man, broken in spirit as well as in body, and he never recovered. He was so ill when the Red Cross found him in the hospital, when in between him working for the Japanese, he became very ill with dysentery and diarrhea and goodness knows what else, malaria, and had to go into a hospital. It wasn't really a hospital, it was a building where I think there were probably British nurses, and there were a couple of doctors actually there, including the doctor who had been there when my brother died, who were looking after the sick people, the really sick ones. And when my mother had crawled down there and come back up again, she went looking for my father, and it was actually somebody from the Red Cross who told her where he was, and he got his first cup of tea, which he writes about glowingly in his book. But no, my father never ever recovered. He lived for 10 years afterwards, but he never recovered. And my mother never spoke of the war. It had simply not happened. She whitewashed it all. They just painted it out of her life, and I was not allowed to talk about it. I wish in some ways I had been able to talk about it, to have asked questions and to have, you know, got some things straight in my mind. But maybe she got it right. She was able to live with it that way. So I suppose, it was her way of coping. How did it affect me? For so long it had been whitewashed out of my life. I thought about it a lot. I talked about it with my father before he died. But with my mother, I never could talk about it. I think I had seen too much for her comfort, and I think she preferred not to remember what I had seen, and I think that was why. But I don't know that it's particularly affected me otherwise. I don't think I can forgive people who claim it hasn't happened. For a nation to claim that they had not committed such atrocities. If they had said, yes, we had, maybe I could forgive. I don't know. But no, I can't forgive a nation that claims they haven't committed such dreadful deeds. I went to Japan in the hopes that I could. But it was not a trip that made me forgive, because I think it was too organised, too arranged. And if I'd been able to go into the streets in Japan and say, and what do you think about it? I think that would have been different. But I think it was too orchestrated. And we only met the people who were sorry, and they were all Christians. And I think most of the older Japanese men just felt they'd done what they were told to do, and that was it. They seemed to have no remorse, and therefore, I am bitter, and that is why I'm bitter, because there is no remorse.